Well, good afternoon, everybody. So I'll be talking about the EOBS and some of the climate monitoring aspects we're doing with this in situ database. And the slides and the information are from a team of people at the ECMWF and the KNMI. So it's no news, of course, to you. We've had a very remarkable summer. So especially from coming from Holland with all its rivers and ponds, a very interesting aspect was that the river level was so exceptionally low, as what you see here in the Rhine near Düsseldorf, for instance. But also other parts of Europe had the same problems. Completely dried up rivers in Italy and France, and having impact on lots of different aspects of society. So in southern France, for instance, drinking water had to be shipped into remote villages simply because of bringing drinking water and sanitation purposes for the people there. But also cattle in the fields had problems with getting to drinking water. Much of the land we've seen in Europe looked like this field in Norfolk, very dry, very yellow, very, prone to wildfires. And clearly when we start to analyze this using some data from the CDS, and you're seeing here the EOBS data, is that this image we have is actually confirmed. So what you're seeing here on the left are the daily mean temperatures of Europe, so a European average daily mean temperature. And the smooth line is clearly the seasonal cycle. And what you're seeing in this graph is that actually since the start of the year, it has been warm in Europe. Especially in the winter right here, February, but also starting in early summer. And actually these high temperatures throughout the year makes that 2021 is actually already the 6th warmest year on record. And that is counting the summer of the autumn and the December months to be very near the usual level. Also, when we look at the temperatures for the summer, and I think Carlo mentioned this earlier, is that the 2022 value really sticks out like a sore finger. It's the warmest summer on record, and not by a small margin. So there's really something going on with this particular summer. So clearly this is interesting, but does it really bring the message home? Does it really account to what the humans feel, what we feel in this in everyday life? And not really. These averaged quantities do not really register the impact these high temperatures have on humans or on vegetation or on whatever. So we need to move a little bit more like quantities like heat wave or dry spell, which are much more relevant, which is what people actually feel. However, you're opening a can of worms when you start to talk about heat waves in Europe, as every Met Service has its own definition, and also a dry spell in Ireland is quite a bit different than a dry spell in central Spain. Fortunately, there are some people who actually thought about that, and there is a joint effort of the WMO and the World Climate Research Program to come up with a set of consistent indices which actually describe these impact-related effects of climate variability and climate change. And these are called the ETCCDI indices. You have to practice on that abbreviation. It's the expert team of climate change detection and indices. And with the team of the ECMWF, we're using this set of indices together with a set of indices defined in a scientific literature to actually assess the effects of climate change and to visualize that. The examples I'll show today are based on the EOBS. The EOBS is a concerted effort of all the European Met Services. What we do is we bring all the data together, the best data we have at each of the Met Services. We collect it in one large database, and based on that we make gridded maps for temperature, precipitation clearly, sea level pressure, wind, humidity, radiation, things like that. All these data are based on in situ data, and the regular EOBS starts from 1950 until now. It's being updated every month, and since recently we also have daily updates of this data set. And there's a research version starting in 1920. So what you see here on the right side of the slide are for temperature and precipitation, the number of stations we are using for this E OBS dataset. And the color coding gives what Paul Polly mentioned last Monday, the data license issues. So also in Europe there are issues with the data license, and every dot here represents a station, but when a dot is colored green, you can actually go on to the website and download the actual data. But when a dot is red, you can't. So there are met services who actually sit on their data and do not allow this data to be shared freely with the scientific community. Fortunately, we can use those data in the E OBS, so they are brought to some use in the E OBS. What you also see is that there is a huge inhomogeneity in the coverage of the land. So clearly, the E OBS will be in this area will have a high quality simply because of the high station density. But when you move more to the south, like Spain or southeastern Europe or into Russia or Belarus, we see that the coverage of stations is actually, well, not too good. And clearly that reflects immediately on the quality of the E OBS. So this is a complete different picture than what you have with the reanalysis, which is much more homogeneous in that sense. On the other hand, all the data which is shown on this picture is not only the synoptic data which go into the reanalysis, but it's much more data than only the synoptic data. So many met services have networks which are much larger than only the synoptic data. And what is included here are also networks from, say, river authorities, which usually have rain gauges, or the Ministry of Agriculture, which may have its own network of rain gauges or temperature sensors as well. We even have in Portugal a company which has professional weather stations in their vineyards. What you see here on the central part of the slide is that this dataset is actually being used quite well by the scientific community. So you're seeing here the number of citations, cumulative for 3 citations. The blue bars are for the citation which refers to the station data, and the red and black bars are for the gridded data. And what you see is that the gridded data is far more popular than the station data. So that really motivates us to put all our energy into developing this gridded data set. But clearly, for doing so, you need access to the in situ data. Okay, so what do we do with this data set? Well, we participate together with colleagues from ECMWF in building this State of the Climate, which we do every year. And there are 2 panels here with figures, one from the State of the Climate 2020, showing the exceptional warm winter around the Baltic in terms of number of ice days. And here on the right you see last year's State of the Climate, showing some hot temperatures in March and some very low temperatures in April. And the reason for showing these 2 pictures is that in February and March there were very high temperatures in Europe. Actually so much that it was about 20 degrees in France already, which made the vineyards in the Bourgogne region already to flower and to blossom. So the production was already going on, or at least the growth of the vegetation was already going on. And then in April we've had this cold spell and devastated about 80% of the grape harvest for that region. So that was one of the reasons for highlighting this particular event. But what you see when you compare these 2 pictures is that although they are nice and have colory figures, they are not very similar. That is not what we want. We want to have something which is much more similar to, which can be recognized from year to year. So they are not very uniform to report. It also takes quite a while to produce such a paper, to produce such a figure. So a dedicated effort is required to make a map like that. And what we need to do when we are looking at events like that, like this very warm winter, we need to look at this particular event from all different sides. So it's a bit like a diamond, which looks different when you look at it from a different angle, with the exception, of course, that climate change is quite a bit uglier than a diamond. So these maps we are producing now for the catalogue, which is, I think, the answer to all these issues, are much more uniform, are much more, we are much more able to give a branded feel of for these maps and much more recognizable to be a product of the Copernicus Climate Change Service. And these are actually the first steps we take towards a interpretation of the raw data. So, while this is very nice, these maps, they can be used by the savvy data journalists to build their own story, but I think many journalists will not be able to pick up a story based on these maps alone. So what I did is I talked to a journalist from the NRC newspaper, one of the quality papers in the Netherlands, and recently he wrote an article using the same E OBS data on, well, an interesting story. And I discussed this issue with him, and he said, well, it's of course interesting to have access to these maps and to the data and blah, 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 but what we would like to have, and I think that's similar to what you said, Helene, is that actually we would need a story. So if you have a story, it's very easy for a journalist to pick this up. And what we're doing in the State of the Climate is we're actually making these stories already, only a couple of months after the event. And what I think is very necessary is that we need to react much more in real time. So using the words of Peter Thorne of yesterday's site event, there is a huge appetite for us to be much more nimble in producing this type of information towards the news people. And clearly, of course, C3S is already moving in that direction. So these are two screenshots from what the C3S comms people already produce. So they are already moving in that direction. But I think the message of the talk is that we can do a little bit better. And by engaging the scientists, we can make a wonderful story, I think, which might be better picked up by the media. Thank you very much.
Hartelijk dank, Gerard van der Schrier. Are there questions for Gerard?
Hi, thank you for an excellent presentation. It's a very loaded question, so to take Helene's advice, I'll ask it as an individual rather than a C3S employee. The map that you showed of data availability was very telling, the red versus the green. And obviously, in an open data environment, we want everywhere in Europe to be green, particularly for historical data, to understand past extreme events so we can model how future extremes relate to these past extreme events. What encouragement can we give to these redder countries to enable open data access to their archives?
Well, the experience we have at KNMI is where we changed to an open data policy quite a few years ago, is that we have now many, many more users of not only of the data, but also of the products we make of this data. So actually it's much more value for money. And that was actually the argument which convinced the government to put in a little extra money, because that is actually the question for many of these met services. They are forced to sell their data because the regular funding is not sufficient. And of course, when you then share your data with the scientific community, you are afraid that, well, data leaks away and things like that. So that would be my take on that. But can I, that is probably not time, but what's interesting about, say, last year, about the summer we've had, is that 100 years ago we've had actually the driest summer on record in Europe. That was 1921. And in COP1 we produced some data together with Cornell on that particular period, and using some research money from other projects we were able to write an article on that. And now what we see is that now that things are very dry again, that this story is being picked up by the media again. And for that particular data set, we needed to address, ask the Met services for additional data. And so we went to, for instance, the Polish Met service. Poland didn't exist in 1920, so they had to go to lots of different archives. But they were very keen to participate and to spend in actually quite a lot of effort. So I think the topic of climate change is very relevant for many of the people in the working floor. So if you address those people, then I think we're in the clear.
Gerard, thank you so much.